We would like to acknowledge the indigenous lands and the cultures of New York. We honor the land as the Creator intended, and that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their cultures, emphasis on culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it provided the foundation for this country as we experience it today. All right, Learning Cafe crowd, let's get active. Now, we did an introduction last time, but we'll do it again because our guest speaker is more than worthy of acknowledgement and recognition. Dr. Dana E. Crawford is a clinical psychologist who's graduated from Howard, Temple, and Miami universities and has degrees in African American Studies, Education, Psychology, and a certification in nursing. Dr. Crawford is also a scholar in residence at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. And finally, she's a developer of the Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training, aka CBRT, author of the R.A.C.E. race cards, and serves as a cultural bias consultant with organizations across the U.S., especially and including ECLC. And we love the work that she does with our community. Representing Buffalo, New York, but currently resides in the heart of Harlem, New York City. Please show your digital love. Welcome for the undisputed heavyweight champion of bias reduction, Dana E. Crawford.
Wow. Well, I don't know what kind of tea or coffee that you are drinking this morning, but the very kind and generous introduction. Thank you so much. And then shout outs to my hometown, Buffalo. Okay, so we're going to dig right into it. This is part two of an amazing panel experience. And we are talking specifically about racial awareness conversations, not just for one group, but for everyone. I thought that this quote, this segment from James Baldwin really captured what the heart and the spirit of this work is.
In a literal sense, you're writing for white people. Are you aware of that?
I'm writing for people, baby. No, I don't believe in white people. I don't believe in black people either, for that matter. But I know the difference between being black and white in this, and at this time. It means that I cannot fool myself about some things that I could fool myself about if I were white.
But more white people read your novels, I believe, than black people.
Well, black people may not read them, but they steal them. And they sell them, they're hot in bars.
You do spend a long time between novels. Why is that?
Well, I'm that kind of writer. There's no answer to that. You know, some people write, I wish I was George Simenon. People write them in 2 weeks, but I can't. And everybody works the way he can work. I must point out, though, too, that I've been working in the last few years between assassinations. And that doesn't make it any easier either. I mean, they're killing my friends. It's as simple as that. And I've been all the years that I've been alive. For no reasons which have any validity.
Why don't you just want to get away somewhere and sit down and write your books? Why don't you want to do that?
Because I'm better than that.
But you don't have to be better than that.
Oh, I do.
So you don't agree, then? I mean, when people say, oh, it's okay for him, he's escaped.
What have I escaped? Where, anyway, would I go to escape? To your country? Would I get a political asylum here? Where would a fleeing black man go if he wanted to escape? There may not be, as much humanity in the world as one would like to see, but there is some. There's more than one would think. In any case, if you break faith with what you know, that's a betrayal of many, 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 many people. I may know 6 people, but that's enough. Love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together, really it is held together, by the love and the passion of very few people. Otherwise, of course, you can despair. Walk down the street of any city, any afternoon, and look around you. What you got to remember is what you're looking at is also you. Everyone you're looking at is also you. You could be that person. You could be that monster. You could be that cop. And you have to decide in yourself not to be.
Today, we're making a decision to not despair. We are the few people that are holding humanity together through love, through connection. Racial awareness conversations for everyone is about just that. There is no escape. There is no place that we can go to if everyone is not liberated, if we're not able to connect. And that may not be a popular movement, but the reality is if we look around in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our states and our countries, this was in 1970. How much has changed? So much has, and so little has as well. We have to figure out a way to have these important conversations and, quite frankly, to connect to what is inside of us, what's between us, and what's around us. Racial awareness conversations for everyone is about engaging in tender conversations. They're a collection of 48 exploratory prompts in a card deck, and they are really meant to be a combination of opportunities for journal, reflection, as well as tools to help us engage in these really hard and tender and critical conversations. I don't know if there's ever been a time, more so in my lifetime than now, in having these conversations. Racism really festers in the shadows of silence, but I think the light of our humanity is where we can really start to shed and get rid of the biases, the prejudice, and the racism that has kept us from understanding each other. This is the race card pledge, and I'm going to read it for each and every one of us so you can take this in before we start our panel conversation, which is a panel of some of the most beautiful human beings in looks, as well as in heart and spirit and mind that I've had the privilege of knowing, and that you'll get an opportunity to get a glimpse in their humanity. But before they engage in a tender and vulnerable conversation for us all to benefit from, let's make sure we make this pledge. And this is in the deck for all of the cards. Here's a little bit of music to help us focus. The race cards provide the content for having tender conversations, but you as the listener, as the user, you're the person that's going to help create healing and learning. These are our 7 commitments. I make a personal commitment to learning about, understanding, and supporting anti-racism. I assume everyone playing the race cards has the best intentions. I recognize that everyone has different experiences and therefore different beliefs. I will monitor my own affective, behavioral, cognitive, and physical reactions to playing the race cards. If I become too overwhelmed, I will take a break or discontinue the game to preserve the relationship with other participants and my optimal health. I will speak with respect and kindness, especially when engaging in difficult conversations. And lastly, although I may disagree with ideas, I will not make personal attacks. This is the beautiful panel today, and we'll start off with a question so they can introduce themselves in the way that is most accurate in who they are, better than I could ever introduce them. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and my panelists will join me. And I introduce the first question, and whoever would like to start us off in answering it, I invite you to unmute when you're ready. Here's the question. It comes from the section that is awareness. There are 3 sections in the racial awareness conversations for everyone deck: awareness, investigation, and reduction. The first question is, which racial / cultural identities make up your heritage?
I'll go. Hi, everyone. My name is Wimoto Naoka. Pronouns are she, her, ella. And recently, the cultural identity that makes up my heritage is coming forward is that I am an artist. I am a writer and a producer. And I am realizing now more than ever that having an artistic mindset is in fact a culture in and of itself. Just being an artist, thinking like an artist, being around other artists, that even when I'm not in that space, it is a lens that either people appreciate or don't appreciate, but seems to differ from folks that don't call themselves artists or feel that they are tapped into that aspect of themselves. I say that because it does seem like everybody has creativity and everybody is an artist in some way. And I do hear a lot of folks saying, well, I'm not artistic, well, I'm not an artist, well, I'm not creative, well, I don't just really, I can't. They start sentences that way. And they just kind of forfeit that about themselves. So being somebody who doesn't do that feels at times important.
I can go next. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Terdell Burrows. When I think about the identities, just I guess the ever-expanding identities that that make up who I am, is visually, I am a Black cisgender male. I am an American descendant of enslaved Africans. I am most recently a father, so that's something that definitely I'm constantly kind of pushes me to consider who I am, my lineage, and definitely what I want to impart to my children. I'm also a gay male as well, and carry just the legacy of struggle that comes with that identity as well, continued struggle that often may conflict with my racial identity as well. Happy to join.
I can go next. Hi, everybody. I'm Teresa Shu. My pronouns are she, her. For the visually impaired, I'm wearing a pink shirt, and I am East Asian. So I identify as a second generation Taiwanese American female, cisgender. I am a psychologist. I say by training because I tend to do many other things as well. And I am also a mother, a parent, a mother. And Terdell, to your point, also thinking through, lineage, and my children are biracial, and, what to instill in them as they're growing up. One last cultural identity I really identify with is being the eldest daughter of immigrants. So I don't know if anybody in the audience is an eldest daughter of immigrants, excuse me, but that also means you're a translator, you're a navigator, you're an administrative assistant, you're also a teacher, you are a researcher. So in some ways it instills pride, and it also gets very overwhelming sometimes. Thank you for having me.
And I guess that leaves me, and it's such a privilege to be here on this panel with all of you. I guess when it comes to cultural identity, I'll also, well, let me start with my name, Paul Bullman, also known as Pinny, which is my Hebrew nickname. And I'll start with the most visibly obvious elements of my identity, which is that I'm a white male with all of the attendant really unfair privileges that certainly has afforded me across my lifespan in our society, which still just has such embedded structural inequities when it comes to things like culture and gender. I would say that when I look in the mirror, though, the aspect of culture that really speaks to how I see myself and what feels most intrinsic to me is the fact that I'm Jewish. And it's actually also not on Zoom, but otherwise a visible element of my identity, because I'm an Orthodox religious Jew, and I wear a kippah, a head covering that's like a signifier of my faith and heritage. And it's really Judaism that I guess connects me with my ancestors and a sense of historical narrative with a set of values and practices that informs my daily life and also my sort of larger life's aspirations. So it really feels kind of at the heart of who I am. A few other pieces that feel important are the fact also I'm a father to two wonderful kiddos. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in Washington Heights. And vocationally, I'm a pediatric psychologist and a poet.
Thank you all for sharing and just for being here. You know, such an interesting thing about this question, because as I hear other people sharing their identity, I feel this urge to be like, oh yeah, me too. Or like, oh yeah, I have that identity. Oh yeah, that I never thought about identifying myself in that way. Or I hadn't thought about the people in my life and recognizing them in that way and like seeing them in that way. And I think I'm really struck by, Teresa, that identity point for you as a daughter of immigrants. And I've known you for years and I don't conceptualize that identity in you. And so it really speaks to how culture is co-defined, right? So it's like how you identify yourself, like you say, Paul, when you look in the mirror. And the invisible identity points. My cultural identities that are always really salient for me have always been being a tall Black woman. I'm very tall on Zoom, I'm not. But being tall, being Black, being cisgender, but also being a thinker is an identity, like a person who questions and reflects, and also being able-bodied most of my life, knowing that that's an identity point that at any point could change. You know, when we were all babies, we weren't. Somebody had to care for our body, and as we age, someone will likely have to help care for our bodies. And so having majority of my life of being able-bodied is a huge identity. The next question, still in the awareness section, and I particularly love this question for this audience because most of the people in this audience work in and work with young people. So the question is, explain how your family and or your community did or did not educate you on race.
It's a great question because it really pushes you to think about your earliest experiences. I know at times that can be a bit kind of gray or foggy because it's so young. We're so young. I think some of the things that I think about is what's not the unspoken and how the unspoken communicates so much. And the unspoken can be at times where you live, where I lived, and what places I did not go to. Not because I was told that it was dangerous, not because I was told that I wasn't welcome, but just this is where this is where we belong, and we don't belong in these other areas, or at least, upon reflection, that's some of the things that I think about. I think at just in my as a younger person, it really, kind of sets that framework or that schema for the places where I feel most comfortable and also the places that I feel most welcome. And when I go into spaces that aren't that might not be reflective of, who I am, my family, my racial group. One, I guess feelings of not uncomfortable, but feelings of now I need to be a bit more performative, or I need to put on an act and put my best foot forward because I'm maybe judged, and and I want to put forth the best presentation of myself versus being in a space where that feels natural and that feels comfortable, and I don't think about those things. So I think that definitely can communicate how you understand race how I understood race as a young person, and just the spaces that I would go in and out of.
Trill, I really appreciate that response and hearing your experiences, and that thinking about like those early experiences and how they really kind of shape you. And I guess what it evokes in me, I'm thinking about there being, like in the question, it was like, I think you said family and or community. And I was reflecting on a sort of difference between those two things for me. Within my family, my parents were very, like, they were very, I mean, the term anti-racist didn't exist at that time, but they were very that much that way. And they very much instilled in myself and my siblings those kinds of values. And in my community, they really, I don't think that race was not discussed much. What was much more of like, not necessarily sometimes talked about overtly, but always a subtext, is more around the, I guess, the dangers of being Jewish, you could say. Like I grew up in a community that was filled with Holocaust survivors. All four of my grandparents were, and many of the people in my synagogue, which was very much kind of shrinking at the time in Washington Heights, but many of them had numbers tattooed on their arms. Like it was very sort of viscerally present, this history. And of course, within like the sort of typical Jewish year and what's sort of acknowledged across time, in terms of that history, the Holocaust is just sort of like, you could say, like, was the most sort of salient and most recent big event of that sort after a whole host of others. And so I would say like a more salient undercurrent was, you know, if like we can't necessarily trust that we're going to be safe around people who are not Jewish necessarily. Certainly not necessarily individuals, but certainly like in terms of societies. So I certainly knew many people who always had their passport ready, you know, because you just never know when it's going to happen here. And so that definitely, I think, was something that kind of shaped me in different ways, community-wise.
This question is really difficult because I'm trying to think of like what did people say or what did people show me? Like to Dell's point of like what is unspoken. And I'm finding a current theme of there was a celebration of who we were through stories and music. I have a lot of artists in my family. So rehearsals in our living room, the music that they were playing, all of that, just a real, like, this is who we are. We enjoy these things. We're just being, and that would always butt up against other folks' ideas. So there was always this, here is when I'm with my family and who we are, and then I have to go out into the world and contend with who they tell me I am. And those things never align. So I think in the conflict is where I learned about race. In both what family and friends celebrated and we were excited about and the way we were, and then the way that would be, the way we would be treated or how that would be insulted when we were in some place where everybody else didn't look like us. If I'm thinking of it like when I was a child and didn't necessarily have that language, that it was like, oh, they not like us. Like it was a little, and then that's where you learn that the space between the distance between those 2 points is how I learned about race.
I don't have much to add here because I think you all have made such incredible points of what's unseen, what is seen, the space between groups. I'm thinking about, I was very lucky. I grew up in Atlanta, so I was very lucky to be exposed to a fairly diverse community in middle and high school. But I also remember my parents, without getting into all of the history of, Chinese American and Taiwanese American culture, but I remember little comments they would make about other races, like, why are you friends with this person? And I'm like, I like them. Why not? But it was always we just don't understand why you've chosen this person to be your friend. And now looking back on it, of course, I understand it much more as racism, whether it's due to, structural impacts or historical events that have, led to this. But I reflect on those and recognize that now I'm like, I know I'm not like that. And I like make every effort to remind myself, okay, I had friends who are of these different races and different cultures, and how that was important to me then and how it continues to be important to me. But it's certainly something that I know I just fought against my parents for.
Wow, you all give such beautiful insights. I feel like that alone could be a master class on like reflecting on those early childhood learnings. And the element that I'll add, because you all touched on so many great points, are the ways in which community taught me. So I moved around a lot, and I remember this space between we accept everyone, and this group might be this way by a stereotype, that group is that way. However, there was a space of like the intimacy. So it was really like I only went to Black people's houses, and Black people only really came to our house, and we were all cool in the community, but like how intimate and close it was. And it wasn't until I was 8 years old that I became best friends with my neighbor who was from China. And I would go to her house and be in her house, and they were like, she has chores, you have chores here. And it was that intimacy that shifted my understanding of race, of culture, because it was like in the home. And I think to this day that one of the biggest barriers of connection with people is it's the intimate relationship. You can have the coworker, but it's like being in someone's home that is a different level of vulnerability. And that's been the space that I've always sought in understanding other. The next question, the last one, I promise I'm going to get out of the awareness, but y'all got so much awareness. This one is also for this audience that are really working with young people. And so the question is, and this is another hard one to your point, Wamoto, describe your first experience with racism, bias, or prejudice.
I will. But before I answer, I want to just quickly touch on something that stood out to me from the last conversation. I guess this interesting dichotomy. I heard celebration and I heard safety were two things that stood out from what everyone said. To celebrate, there's a level of like free authenticity that you're expressing, and then safety, there's a level of kind of protection and being closed off because you're also kind of trying to preserve and live. And so that's just something that stuck out to me based on what the other panelists was saying. And I think that's something I'll probably be sitting on and continuing to digest, when this is over. But moving to the question, so at least my first experience that I really remember that stands out, I was in middle school, and my middle school, I was born in Washington, D.C. When I was younger, I moved to the suburbs of Maryland, Langley Park, for elementary, middle school. It's a big melting pot of a lot of different cultures. Right now, it's largely Central American Latino community. It's changed a bit from when I was younger. But when I could walk home from middle school. It wasn't that close, but we would walk sometimes. It's maybe 40 minutes, 45 minutes. It's the 80s, so you let your kids walk these long distances. And we would walk through this wooded area to get to the apartment building where we lived. And I was confronted with a much older, I can't remember how much older, I probably at the time was around 11. And there was a Latino gentleman who confronted me and my friends who were walking and were bullying us. And I remember him saying, I hate you. You're the N-word. I don't like N-words because they think they're all that. And I think that was the first time that it really stung me. And I was like, whoa, what? You hate me? Like, you don't know me. I don't know you. And I just remember being really frightened, wanting to get out of there, wanting to get home. I actually never told my parents this. As I think about it now, I've never discussed this incident with my parents. I may have shared it with some friends before many years ago, but that's probably the most first kind of visceral experience that stood out to me, with someone kind of really directly explicit saying something that was really racially charged.
I can share next. You know, and also Turdell, just to follow up on what you were talking about in terms of safety and celebration. I love what you said about that. I think it's so on point for what we're all trying to do for ourselves in some ways. So my first experience that I can remember was actually at a Circuit City, if you all remember that. It's a electronics store. And I remember going in with my dad to buy something. Don't remember what it was. But I remember he kept walking around and walking around and walking around. I was like, why are we walking around? And he was like, nobody's helping me. He's like, they're being racist. And I remember at that time, I'm like, Dad, you're overreacting. I absolutely look back on it now and I'm like, oh, he was right. There was a white family that had walked in and they had been helped first. And I know that had happened because he pointed it out too. And I remember at that point, I was like, it was like a denial, like brushing it off, like this can't be the case. Like, you know, we're it's not like we're like, I don't know, like dressed poorly, like we can't afford things here, you know, nothing like that. How could they do this? But yeah, I look back on it now and I'm like, oh yeah, that was racism.
I'm
One
actually
of the
gonna oh, go ahead. Oh, I think it has to go with it has to be the same instance that we used in our as a case study in one of our facilitated workshops, Dana. So I must have been in the first grade or second, somewhere first or second grade. And I was in a predominantly white school and I wore my hair down and all of the kids made a game of sticking pencils in my hair because they were tickled pink that the pencils wouldn't fall out. And I kept telling them to stop and they kept doing it and laughing. And I got upset and I took the pencil out and I threw it up against the chalkboard. And then I got in trouble for being angry.
Wow. That's a powerfully disturbing first experience. Yeah, as you all have been talking, I guess what I've been thinking about is the way in which I feel like there was a lot of like my first experiences. I don't know that I necessarily remember exactly, and I feel like there were a number of experiences that I didn't even know were that, you know, until later. Um, and as I was thinking about the question, I was thinking about it both in terms of towards myself and also in terms of towards people of other sort of races and cultures. Um, Towards myself, one thing that kind of sticks out is I remember at some point when I realized that across my life that people like when they once in a while there'd be people who'd like throw a penny at me or something like that, like a small coin. And I remember realizing at a certain point, maybe hearing from someone, oh, that's because you're Jewish. Like it's a thing that, you know, because it's sort of like this thing that, you know, that we're cheap and we're money greedy or whatever, that, you know, that those sort of stereotypes. And so it's like a way of like putting you down because you're Jewish. So I was just thinking about the ways that sometimes we don't even realize. I mean, there were things like swastikas on the synagogue and things like that that were more obvious, but so many times there are things that I didn't even know until later on in life. And I Kirsten, one of sort of the larger things, you know, I grew up in Washington Heights, I mentioned, and really there was so much happening around me that I just took for granted and I didn't think about it. And I remember when I realized at some point, like all the stop and frisk and all the times that I'm seeing people like lined up against a wall with like police, you know, doing their thing, and but never me, never me. You know, and until there was one time that I was walking down my block and I noticed that there was this unmarked car that was sort of like rolling alongside me. And I was like, I was getting ready to be, and it was going the wrong way, by the way. It was a one-way street in the other direction. So I was like, I was getting ready to run. And then I heard a voice being like from the car saying, "Come here, kid," and like kind of called me over. And I realized that they're cops, and they're kind of comparing my face to like this mugshot that they had of like this, I guess a skinny white dude who had done something. And the feeling that I had, that's really when I like internalized the way like, oh my God, like this has happened to me once, and it wasn't even that bad. And this is happening to other people in this neighborhood like all the time. And it just really brought home to me how much I had seen of things that were racist, that were just really speaking to the structural inequities and inequalities in the neighborhood and in society that I wasn't aware of until much later.
You know, before I even respond to all of your shares, I just want to just name the amount of hurt. I want to name it trauma, right? Like just all of these are traumas. And so much of racism gets packaged as racism and doesn't get amplified as what it is, which is trauma. And so I'm just sorry for the trauma that you experienced and the injustice. I'm also struck by how alone, little Wimoto, little Trudell, little Teresa, little Penny were. You're little people and no adults to really help you navigate it. Even for you, Teresa, as your dad named it, then what? And I think we often leave young people to figure out this big, huge thing that has been the humanitarian crisis of many generations, if not all. And there's now a movement for kids not to even get to talk about it, right? Like you don't get a book, you can't even read about it. You can't even go to your public library in some places to try and like make meaning of this bizarre thing. The other part that really struck me is the disorientation that racism sometimes brings. Like, no, it can't be. Like, you kind of have to be like a racism detective. Like, oh yeah, like you have to be able to know it so precisely in this thing that no one's explained to you before as a young person. And I think even as adults, we continue to grapple with, was it racism? Was it not? And it's so disorienting and gaslighty. So I want to name that. I'm looking at time and I gotta like, I have like seven more cards I want to ask you. But I want to ask this question because I think a lot of people struggle with it. What are the barriers? It says 3, but I'll say just 1 or however, whatever. What are the barriers you face when having honest conversations about race? What gets in the way?
Nobody wants to believe you. They always want to explain, well, this, well, that, well, were you really? If race and gender, because those two things are never separate from me. I can't divorce one from the other. So it doesn't matter even if it's a member of my community, if there's gender involved. Oh, well, you were blah, blah, or are you sure? Or, women, blah, blah. Always, nobody wants to believe you. And then either somebody who looks like them has to co-sign it, or someone that they care about that occupies the same identities as you, they see that and then they'll say something like, you were right. And that's even worse, the whole surprise and then this like assumption that you needed this validation instead of just believing the words that came out of your mouth. So oftentimes it is that I actually no longer do that now. Engage in those kinds of conversations. The minute it starts off with, well, but I'm like, okay, then this person isn't actually ready to have this conversation. And so I think that stops probably a lot of conversations about a lot of biases. It's just the other person just wanting to explain it away before anything else.
I would say trust and opportunity. If the opportunity has not been taken to cultivate relationships, trusting relationships with people of other racial, ethnic backgrounds, like true trust, then having those honest, authentic, difficult conversations would be really difficult. The relationships that I do have with people who don't look like me or come from, or have the same historical experience that me or my racial group has had, those relationships where there is that deep trust there, we have those conversations, and they can be difficult at times. They can be healing, they might even be a little comical sometimes. We may say some things that I wouldn't say here, but we may say some things together because there is this kind of foundational trust that we have. So I think that if not having the opportunity to build those relationships in different spaces in life will really, prevent or become a barrier to having that conversation.
I would add fear and comfort, fear of change and comfort with where your beliefs are. I think that, in addition to the two of those, somewhere mixed in there is like this unawareness, comfort with unawareness, maybe not like a lack of empathy, but like an inability to truly feel empathic in a way that feels genuine. And I'm thinking, I'm still stuck on this last question. Sorry, so if I can go back a bit, because I was thinking about what Paul had said about internalizing how an experience is for other people. And I'm thinking about COVID-19 and Asian hate. And I remember thinking to myself, I was like, oh, I'm getting a tiny little sliver of what it's like to be Black in America, like a tiny little sliver of that. And so that, bridging that gap and understanding was, I think, really powerful for me.
And I appreciate that, Teresa, and really everyone's comments, I think, also struck me. Like I feel those as well, those barriers. And I just would add, I think there's a little bit of a fear of being judged too, of like, what if I accidentally say whatever the wrong thing would be, something that would make people feel uncomfortable, or people feel like I'm a bad person in some kind of way. And I also feel, I think, like a little bit of a pressure too, like, I mean, I guess as someone who is like a visibly Orthodox Jew, there's always this pressure, like, are people going to interpret what I say as meaning like, so all Jewish people think this way, and so if I mess up in some kind of way and I'm judged, it's like, oh, she should have heard this, So it just, there's just like this extra pressure to, I don't know, just say the right thing. And if there's a topic that's a little bit of a minefield, sometimes it's easier to avoid. And it takes like willpower to say, or not just willpower, but a value and having a specific goal to steel yourself and say, this is important anyway.
Yeah, every point you raised are the reasons why I developed the race cards. And when Turdell and Wimoto were doing focus groups for the race cards, and we had, I think at some point, like 300 questions, and now we're at 48. And today we've only gone through 3. We're like, it'll take people a lifetime to have these questions. It came down to having that tool, having something to help, like some transitional object. I can hold this card. The card says the thing, not me. I didn't ask that question. But I do think it requires a decision to be in these vulnerable places. And I don't know about you all, I just feel like when I say the wrong thing, I actually learn a lot more than all the ways I've been taught to say these other things, or that I learned somewhere along the lines of these rules. And these rules end up being shackles and cages for actual, like, keeping us from actually connecting. I know there are so many more questions, and I know, Turdell, you have a specific question, but I also know the audience might have. Participants are those who are joining us in this journey may have some questions. So I want to open that up. But before I open it up to the community, the larger community, I do want to ask this one last question that I always like to ask everyone if I can find it. what have you learned from playing the race cards? In a short couple sentences, words, what have you learned today in playing the race cards?
I guess I would just say the importance of having these conversations, like coming on the heels of what I was saying before. Dana, when you first asked me, hey, would I be interested? Would this be something that would be possible? So part of me was like, yeah, part of me was like, wait, you know, um, and and it took like some amount of willpower to say, no, this is really a value. This is something that feels important to me to do, and important not just to me to do, but just generally to do. And I do feel that there is this, like playing the race cards just kind of brought home, that yes, like this is something that really, is just important for people to be doing, to be able to have these kinds of conversations.
I very personally will say that as the eldest daughter of immigrants, it's very hard to show vulnerability when you're supposed to be like a pillar of strength, right? So, but I do think that these cards allow you to be vulnerable, and allow for growth that's so necessary for all of us.
I'll make it quick. I feel very connected to you all. Just hearing about your experiences, hearing about, traumatic, vulnerable experiences, that makes me feel more connected to you all. And that just makes me think how many other people who are walking around who have had similar traumatic experiences, and to be more graceful to people.
Well, I think the genius of the cards is that you do them and you're like, oh, we survived. We lived. Nothing bad happened. It was just a pleasant conversation on a Thursday afternoon. So I always feel like that's like the greatest takeaway. I think, to circle back to the top of fear and comfort being I think that Teresa, you said that is like, this is why people don't want to have it. And it's like, look, nothing to be scared of. We're all pretty comfortable. It's okay. So that's my main takeaway. That and racism is really creative. There's a through line between everything that happened to us, but the ways, like the pennies, Paul, I'm like, wouldn't have even put those two things together. And then I also thought, like, who has pennies to throw? Who even has pennies to throw? Like, just the effort. So yeah, wow. It's gonna take creative ways to dismantle this, because it's a very creative thing.
Thank you all. Someone put in the comments, and I want to make sure I honor their words. I want to thank everyone for your vulnerability. I'm feeling this conversation down to my bones. That's how I'm feeling it in my bones. Elijah, I want to open it up. Do we have any questions from the community? If you haven't put in a question, now is the time. Any questions that we should attend to?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for providing the space, Dana. And before we do that, we have a couple of links that we would like for you to engage before I read these final questions. I'm not sure if we'll have time, so please accept my apologies ahead of time if I don't get to your question. But we have two things. We have two evaluation links, one for ECLC, another for Dr. Dana Crawford. It's important for us to realize that any revolutionary change of heart, mind, and deed requires participation. We can't have spaces like this. We can't have panels like this. We can't have programs like the Learning Cafe without your support and your participation. So please just cue these surveys up for Dana and for us at ECLC. And we also have a link for those of you who are interested in purchasing the race cards from Dr. Dana E. Crawford. She has a special link and a special sale at 20% off. Click on the link, look it up, share it, get your cards, use them. They are really beneficial for those of you who are service providers, educators across the board. They really do help have those hard conversations. So we have a couple. I guess I will start and see where we get. And these are questions for anyone on the panel. So feel free to add in. One says, How can one respond constructively to racially insensitive remarks made by loved ones or family members?
Well, I'll jump in quickly. I think, and I'll just give a reference so people have a chance to speak. So I've developed this model called the Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training, CBRT, and part of that model has an acronym called LET UP. And it starts with first recognizing what is so activating for you in this person saying this thing. So it starts with recognizing your stuff, because before you can start to engage and check somebody else, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. And so it really starts with that self-regulation. So then you're able to engage in a way that is useful. From that self-regulation, then it moves to talking, and it's really talking in a way that you set your priorities. Many times racism makes you feel like you have to be the commander in chief in every single way and know the exact wording and the exact phrase and have the websites and have the references and be witty and quick with it. No. And so it really recognizes, what is my priority right now? Is it to name? Is it to connect? Is it to understand? Is it to inform? And then lastly, it comes to a space of having unconditional neutral regard and not viewing people as a caricature of their biases, racism, and prejudice, but instead as fully dynamic beings. And lastly, having a plan for how you'll continue that ongoing conversation, because it is your family. So you're going to see them again, and you're going to have more than enough opportunities, because they're going to be racist, prejudiced, and biased again. And so recognizing it's an ongoing journey of change.
Thank you, Dana. Did anyone, I don't know, I'm not sure if anyone wanted to add into that or still needed to gather thoughts. It was another question that popped up in the chat. I just want to acknowledge it from Harris. Not bringing up trauma is a form of survival. How does one find courage to engage?
What the immediate thing that popped into my mind on hearing that last question was, I think having a value of it's about finding courage, but it's not just finding courage, it's about giving courage. It's about being the kind of person, ideally, I mean, and this is something that I would love to aspire to, who can help other people feel a sense of courage, helping them feel that, like Dana was just talking about, that unconditional regard. People need to feel that from you before they can find the courage to engage. So it's about yes, like sometimes we have to find our courage to engage and to share, but also it needs to be in the right context. And we can be the people who can create that context for the other person to engage.
I'll quickly add as well. When I think about trauma, trauma is an injury. It's a psychological injury. It may, for some, be a spiritual injury. And I want to give the analogy of when we experience a physical injury, we name it. We say, my finger's broken. We say, I'm bleeding here. We say, I have this cut. And then the path to healing, once we recognize and call it and recognize and say what this is, then we put ourselves on the path to say, okay, what do I do to remedy or to cure or to fix whatever this injury is? And I think, and I equate that with talking about racism and other traumatic events. We have to name it, even if that starts with naming it privately in our own space before sharing it with others, and maybe starting there as a part of our path toward healing.
I would also add that having realistic expectations about pace and method of healing, excuse me, thinking about trauma as something, survival, right? You said survival, and it's worked for so long. So thinking about what it means to take away that avoidance, and how that exposes, you to so many different, so much pain, and what that process looks like for everybody is different. But I think setting that realistic expectation for what that healing will look like is also a good first step.
I feel that a lot of the answers that folks have shared could really apply to both questions of how you deal with a family member and also doing this without necessarily reliving a trauma, of being honest about what this healing looks like, what this conversation with this person that you love might really, where am I actually, what can really happen based on where you are and where they are. And then one thing that Dr. Crawford had said, like strategic vulnerability in a way where I'm going to tell you this thing to make something clear to you. I'm going to tell you this personal thing, and I'm making a point here. I'm revealing something through this story, so that it's not just whatever trauma that happened to you, but you're actually pulling something specifically. And then how empowering that can be to be like, I had this horrible thing happen to me, and right now is actually a good time to bring it up, can be healing because you are not avoiding, as Teresa said. And then it can facilitate a tender conversation with whoever, and it might really land with a family member if they were there.
Truly insightful. Thank you so much to everyone on the panel for modeling a brave space with transparency and just genuine care and concern. And most importantly, to our audience joining in virtually, thank you so much. You could have been anywhere, but you chose to take the time out to be intentional with us. We hope that you were able to learn something new. Until next time, please be safe, prosperity and good health to you. Be well, take care of yourself, and be safe. Until next time, everyone. Thanks for joining.